Okay, Mike, I'm monitoring the front door to make sure everybody can get in.
Awesome, thank you.
Good idea.
Are you guys able to see the presentation out in Zoom land?
Yes.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Hey, Sue, hey, Mac.
Yes.
Mac, you've got a collector's item there, your Habitat for Humanity of Teller County. I know, isn't that sad? I talked to Lisa, do you know Lisa Masters, who was one of the women that was gonna buy the next unit?
Yeah.
And she and her daughter had volunteered out there a lot, and I volunteered with her a couple times. And she said that not only did they keep her $300 deposit, but after telling her that she wasn't gonna get her deposit back and she wasn't gonna be able to get a unit, they asked her to come in and volunteer to help finish up the last 2 units. Hey, Joe. Now I wonder if that's why Keith left, you know, if he kind of saw the writing on the wall. I'll have to talk to him about that. All right. Thank you for turning out on this chilly night. Tuning in via Zoom, I appreciate that. So we are going to continue the story that we began last week. I bet this is Carol joining us by phone. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Pope's Forgery. Oh, hey, Myers, good to see you. Didn't see you guys sneak in there. So as a reminder of our course objectives, twofold. Tonight, we're going to get into the heart of bullet number 1, right? How the popes became temporal rulers in addition to spiritual rulers, okay? And then next week, we're going to learn the papacy resurrected the Roman Empire and created the medieval ideal of government. So by way of a review, we got all kinds of people jumping in. All right, so by way of review, we've got a map of Europe circa 750 AD, and let's remind ourselves of the key players in our story. We've got the Byzantine Empire shown here in green. And remember that the Byzantine Empire is a modern term for the Roman Empire, okay? It's just the part of the Roman Empire that didn't fall to the barbarians in the 400s and that kept chugging along and will keep chugging along for 1,000 years. The Lombards were one of the barbarian successor states who had taken over big pieces of Italy. And remember that Italy was kind of divided in two. You've got the north part and the south part that are controlled by the Lombards. And then we've got this little kind of skinny strip that is I don't know. Can you guys see my pointer?
Yes.
So that skinny strip of green in the middle is what remains of the Roman Empire in Italy. Yeah, Gary.
What is your definition of barbarian?
Barbarian for this class really is any of the peoples that invaded the Roman Empire and took over chunks of the Roman Empire, non-Romans, okay, that took over the Roman Empire after the fact. Whether they were barbarians is kind of a, a qualified statement, but it's a term to use that because we don't really have anything better to use, right? Some people have talked about the Germanics or successor states, but they weren't all Germanic. So barbarian is what we're left with. The Franks, shown in pink up here on the map, were another barbarian successor state. They controlled Europe north of the Alps. Most of what is now France, Belgium, the Netherlands, a good chunk of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, okay? And then we talked about the Muslims, okay? And the Muslims are purple on here. The Muslims had exploded on the scene in the 600s, and by the time of our story, they are knocking on the door of the Roman Empire. They've already taken over a big chunk of the Roman Empire because, of course, Egypt and the Holy Land and Syria were all parts of the Roman Empire. The Muslims have conquered that, and they are pressuring the Roman Empire on the east there in Turkey. And in Europe, they have invaded Spain. And as we saw last week, the Franks had actually turned back a Muslim invasion of Europe, possibly saving Europe for Christianity, okay? So we talked last week about the papacy's problems in 750 AD, and the chief among these is the Lombards, because as you can see on this map, they're part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire in Italy is squeezed in this kind of Lombard vice. And the papacy, the Romans in general, don't want to be conquered. They don't want to be ruled by the Lombards because they consider them unwashed barbarians, right? Guys who drink out of the skulls of their, former kings, okay? They're barbarians, okay? And in fact, the Romans, the papacy, despise the Lombards as descended from the race of lepers, okay? The papacy should be able to count on protection from their overlord, from the emperor in Constantinople. But as we saw, the emperor has bigger fish to fry, bigger problems to deal with. He's got the Muslims, who are this juggernaut. They've taken over all of North Africa, Spain, much of the Middle East, right? And they are a constant threat on his eastern border. And within living memory, they have attacked Constantinople itself, the capital of the Roman Empire. And then from the north, they're dealing with this new invasion of barbarians, the Bulgars, okay? So he does not have the troops to spare to deal with remote Italy. Instead, he's got problems closer to home. And as we saw last week, there's also a religious division between the Pope and the Emperor. The Emperor is making war on icons, little pictures of Christ and other holy things that, in his view, is not consistent with the Ten Commandments prohibition against graven images, okay? But it's very important in common Christianity for most of the people who are illiterate, right? They rely on icons as kind of the focus of their devotion. So that is dividing the emperor from his subjects, and in particular from the Pope. So as we saw last week, the scene was set for the Franks to become beholden to the papacy because they came knocking, asking for a favor. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but remember what we learned about the Franks last week. They're this superpower north of the Alps. They control a huge amount of territory, very powerful barbarian kingdom. But they have this strange setup with their monarchy, right? They've got this set of figurehead monarchs that historians call the do-nothing kings, the Merovingian dynasty, that was descended from that strange mythical creature, the Quinatar, and the kings never cut their hair, and the Franks believed that their power resided in their long hair, right? So they've got this strange monarchy that doesn't actually rule. Instead, rule is exercised by this figure called the mayor of the palace, okay? And when we get to 750 AD, we've got a mayor of the palace named Pepin, who has got a particular problem. He's got threats from within his own family to his rule. He's got his brother, who had been his co-mayor originally, and his brother 3 years earlier had just thrown it all away and decided to become a monk. He had moved to Italy and devoted his life to becoming a monk. But this brother has some young sons who are starting to make noise that they want a share of the power. They want their father's inheritance. And Pepin also has this estranged half-brother who likewise is trying to take power from him. And in Pepin's mind, this Merovingian puppet king that he has to keep on the throne because it has this mystique, this charisma that the Franks believe they need a Merovingian in order to succeed. He starts to view that as a liability, right? That one of these rivals could get a hold of the Merovingian puppet king and have that puppet king claim that Pepin is not the correct, true mayor of the palace, that whoever controls him is. So that's where we got to Pepin writing to the Pope and asking for the unthinkable, right? We want St. Peter's sanction for overturning this ancient, revered Merovingian dynasty. And we saw Pepin anointed king of the Franks last week with the Pope's blessing. In fact, with the Pope's command, right? The Pope had written a letter commanding the Franks to put Pepin on the throne. And that is where Pepin got himself in hock to the papacy, even if he didn't understand that that was the case. Any questions about what we covered last week before we get into new material? I want to talk a little bit more about how Pepin conducted this diplomacy with the papacy. Because really, when Pepin sent that question to the papacy, is it good that the kings of the Franks wield no real power? He really knew already what the answer was going to be, because he had conducted very careful behind the scenes diplomacy with the papacy ahead of that. So he really wasn't taking any chances when he sent that. And his intermediary in this effort to overthrow the ancient Merovingian dynasty was a figure named Boniface, okay? Boniface was an Anglo-Saxon missionary working to convert souls in the eastern edge of the Frankish Empire, among the Thuringians. You can see them kind of on the far eastern extremity of the Frankish Empire. The Frankish Empire comprised parts of what used to be the Roman Empire, and some of the people in the Frankish Empire considered themselves Romans, right, who were under the thumb of unwashed barbarians. But on the far eastern extremes of the Frankish Empire are these Germanic tribes who probably knew nothing of Rome whatsoever, nothing of civilization. And so Boniface came from the Anglo-Saxon race, England, okay? And the English had been converted from paganism around the year 600. They had invaded Britain. They were one of the successor states, or actually multiple successor states to the Roman Empire up in the Roman province of Britain. And in 600 AD-ish, it was the papacy who said, we need to send a Christian missionary delegation to convert the pagan English. And if you come to my class in the spring, we're going to look at that conversion in detail, because it's a fascinating story of how the church goes about converting barbarians. And we have great documentation of it. But because it was the papacy that had sent this delegation to the English and had set up the original Christian church in England, there was a very close relationship from day one between the Anglo-Saxons and the papacy, much more so than existed between the Franks and the papacy. The Franks had been converted through, an amorphous process that we don't fully understand, but it wasn't a delegation sent by the papacy. So the Anglo-Saxons have always had a very close relationship with the papacy, and they embraced Christianity once it took hold, to the point that you get guys like Boniface in the 700s saying, we have these kinsmen on the continent where we originally came from who are still pagans. I'm going to devote my life to going and converting, my distant 10th cousins to Christianity. So that's what Boniface is doing. But Boniface does something slightly different when he goes to Europe to begin his missionary activity. Before he does that, he actually goes to Rome and he meets with the Pope. And the Pope names him Bishop of the wilds of Germania. In other words, bishop of an area that doesn't have any Christians in it. So if you're going to act as a bishop, you're going to have to convert some people to Christianity and build some churches, okay? But that's what Boniface does. But he goes up and begins his missionary activity with the backing of the Pope. And in fact, the Pope names him his official legate north of the Alps. So he's got not just the office of bishop behind him, he's actually a representative of the Pope. And Boniface becomes kind of this heroic figure in Christian lore by the way that he begins his missionary activity. He finds out that there's this group of pagans and they've got this revered tree called Thor's oak. And there's all kinds of donations around the base of this tree. They believe it's sacred to their god Thor, right? The god of thunder, okay? And so Boniface goes there with his little group of missionaries, and he takes an axe and he starts chopping away at Thor's oak. And of course, these pagans start gathering around, what is going on here? And Boniface starts making noise like, Thor, do you hear me? I'm chopping away at your sacred tree. Come smite me. And of course, the pagans all believe that that's what's going to happen, that their god Thor is going to strike him down. But instead, a giant wind comes up and blows the tree over that he has weakened. And now Boniface has their attention, okay? He has shown the pagans the power of the one true God through this event. And from that day forward, his missionary activity starts to take hold. So Boniface, by the time we get to 750 AD, Boniface is like 75 years old, okay? And he has been operating out in the wilds, converting the Germanic pagans to Christianity. So he's a legendary figure with this fantastic story behind him, okay? So he's well known to the Franks. Charles Martel, who we learned about last week, he was the mayor of the palace who turned back the Muslims. Charles Martel had supported what Boniface is doing because Charles believed that if everybody in the Frankish Empire were Christian, it would be that much easier to rule this vast empire. And when we get to Charles's sons, Pepin and Carloman, they go one step further. And they work with Boniface to undertake a reformation of the Frankish church, to try and make it more like the Roman church, the things that they were doing with their liturgy that was deviant from what the Romans thought was the right way to do it. They work with Boniface to kind of make everything uniform. So when Pepin gets to the point that he wants to reach out to the Pope for permission to overthrow the Merovingian dynasty, the guy that he uses as his intermediary is Boniface, right? Boniface is in touch with the Pope, right? Because he's the Pope's legate. And in fact, occasionally he travels down to Rome to see the Pope. But by the same token, Pepin has cred with Boniface, right? He's a good son of the church, and Boniface can recognize the threats to Pepin's rule that Pepin himself recognizes. So that's how it is when Pepin finally takes that final step to send his message to the papacy. He knows what the answer is. Boniface has laid the groundwork, right? And he's been able to do this on the QT, very quietly, right? Boniface is way out in the middle of nowhere, right? So the people who are most closely attached to the Merovingian dynasty have no idea what Boniface is up to, that he's conducting this correspondence with the papacy. So that is the story behind Pepin's coup d'etat. All right, so now we get to the meat of the act, if you will. The Pope is going to call his marker that he has gotten from Pepin, even though Pepin doesn't know it, right? In the Lombard kingdom, we have a new king on the scene, a guy named Aistulf. The previous king was a guy named Ratchus, and Ratchus was a very peace-minded king. He had not attempted to make war on the imperial territories. He was fine with the territory that the Lombards controlled. But around 750, Ratchus decides to become a monk, okay? Now, this may have been forced upon him by a party among the Lombard warriors who were anxious to renew the ways of warfare. We don't know, but we end up with a warrior king, somebody who is interested in reviving the expansionist policies of the Lombards, closing that gap in Italy, uniting Italy under the Lombard crown. So in 751 AD, the same year that Pepin is finally crowned king of the Franks, the Lombards renew their aggressions and they actually seize the city of Ravenna. And if you remember, Ravenna was the capital of that Italian slice of the Roman Empire. That's where the emperor's representative, the exarch, made his capital in Ravenna. So the Lombards seize Ravenna, the capital of Roman Italy, and they demand tribute from the city of Rome, from the papacy. And now the Romans and the papacy are completely alarmed, right? Their worst fears are coming to pass. The Lombards are on the march. They are headed toward Rome. But at this point, Aistulf, as aggressive as he is, stops in his tracks. He shrinks from the idea of attacking Rome, attacking the city where St. Peter lives, because he's a Christian just like the rest of Western Europe, and he's in awe of the power of St. Peter. So instead of attacking Rome, he and the papacy make a treaty that's supposed to last 40 years, okay? Good biblical number, right? A 40-year treaty. So they make this treaty, and Aistulf agrees to leave the Romans as they are. He's going to keep Ravenna, but I won't attack Rome. While he's making this treaty, the Pope continues making appeals to the emperor to attack the Lombards. And when Aistulf finds out about this, finds out that this peace treaty that he's just made, or the guy he's just made this peace treaty with, is trying to get the emperor to attack him, he literally tears up the treaty 4 months into the 40-year term of the treaty. And it's possible that it was the Archbishop of Ravenna, who was the natural rival of the papacy for religious power in that area, who may have whispered in the ear of Aistulf what the Pope was doing, okay? And gotten Aistulf to tear up this 40-year treaty after 4 months. So now the Romans are in terror, right? They've really made the Lombards mad. They've made this madman, Aistulf, angry and given him cause for revenge. And so all kinds of wild rumors circulate throughout the city of Rome about the atrocities that the Lombards commit, you know, the nasty things they do to your wives and children, that kind of stuff. So the Romans are terrified, okay? And they're basically defenseless. So the first thing the Pope does is we've got to call in St. Peter. So they take the treaty, their copy of the treaty that didn't get torn up, okay? And they tack it to a cross. And then there's a very, very solemn procession, starting at the Papal Palace, which is on the southeast side of Rome. And they walk all the way across the city of Rome, a couple miles to St. Peter's Basilica, which is on the northwest side of Rome, okay? And they're carrying this cross before the Pope, and all of the clergy of Rome are in tow, and all the citizens of Rome are lining the streets, watching this go on. And the Pope is walking the whole way across the city of Rome. They go to St. Peter's Basilica. And there, behind the high altar, is the actual tomb of St. Peter himself. And because the church had been built over the top of St. Peter's tomb, you actually kind of look down a shaft to see St. Peter's tomb maybe 15, 20 feet below the level of the altar. So they go to this place where they're looking down the shaft, and they take the treaty off of the cross, and they slowly lower it and lay it on top of St. Peter's tomb, as if, St. Peter, look at what has been broken that was made in your name. So after this ceremony to bring maximum attention from St. Peter to their problems, the Pope orders the Roman Church to clean up its act, okay? The reason that we're in trouble is because we've been slacking off. So all of the clergy throughout the city of Rome are given brand new vestments, okay? No more patches, no more frayed edges. everybody's looking spiffy, looking the way they should, okay? And all those priests and deacons and other functionaries in the church who've gotten themselves into hock to loan sharks, the Pope pays off their debts, tells them not to get into debt again, okay? And by gosh, we're going to follow all the proper church schedules, right? There's going to be a mass at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a mass at 6 o'clock, and we're actually going to do it. We're not going to sleep in and miss mass this time. So they're behaving, right, the way that they think St. Peter wants them to behave. So the emperor, remember the Pope, has been sending entreaties to the emperor saying, we need troops, right? The Lombards have taken Ravenna. If you don't want to lose everything you've got in Italy, send troops now. Well, the emperor, instead of sending troops, sends a negotiator, okay? Which the Pope is like, this is the last thing I need, okay? And to further stick his thumb in the eye of the Pope, seemingly, he holds another council there in Greece that condemns icons. So it basically exacerbates the whole issue that's dividing them in the first place. So it's as if the Pope or the emperor is saying to the Pope, I don't care what happens to you. In fact, if you would fall in with me on icons, maybe we could talk, right? But that ain't going to happen. So the Lombards, for their part, go back on the warpath, and they seize a town very near Ravenna. In fact, or very near Rome. In fact, it's a town where the church, where the papacy owns a bunch of income-generating property. So they capture this town and basically steal some land directly from the papacy. And this is where the Pope says, all right, I have to appeal to the Franks. But he knows that the Frankish nobility is going to be reluctant to intervene, right? Because remember, after Charles Martel had turned back that Muslim invasion of Europe, the Muslims still held the southern part of France, the southern part of Gaul. They still owned that little strip along the Mediterranean coast. And Charles Martel went to war against the Muslims to try and push them back over the Pyrenees. He wanted to deprive them of a base of operations north of the Pyrenees so they couldn't repeat their attempt to conquer Europe. And in that effort, where he's attacking the Muslims in Gaul, he's aided by none other than the Lombards. So the Franks and the Lombards are friends, and in the lifetime of the Frankish warriors existing in 750, they can remember a time when they fought shoulder to shoulder alongside the Lombards against the Muslims, against the infidel. And in fact, if you remember, when Pepin came of age and was ready to be invested with arms, his father gave that honor to the Lombard king. That's how close they were. So now the Pope is going to come to the Franks and say, make war on the Lombards. The Frankish aristocracy, the warrior class, are going to be predisposed against that. So the Pope knows that he needs to go and make his case in person. He's going to have to do something no Pope has ever done before. Leave Rome, go north of the Alps, and speak directly to the Franks. But he's got a problem. He can't even send an ambassador north of the Alps because the Lombards have kind of figured out that this might happen. So they have closed the passes. No papal ambassador is going to make his way over the Alps. The Lombards are not going to let this happen, okay? They've shut off communication between Gaul and Italy. So what the Pope does is he finds a pilgrim, a guy from north of the Alps who has come to Rome to visit St. Peter's tomb and all the holy sites of Rome, and he smuggles a message on the person of this pilgrim who is returning home. And this pilgrim manages to get under the noses of the Lombards, who are trying to shut off any communication between the papacy and the Franks. And what the Pope is asking for is an invitation from Pepin to come visit. He knows the Lombards are not going to be able to stop him if he's been invited by the Frankish king. In this message that he smuggles north of the Alps, the Pope writes to Pepin, imploring him to secure the interests of your patron, St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, okay? And again, St. Peter holds the keys to the gates of heaven, so he's got that implicit threat there, right? St. Peter is the one who's being threatened by the Lombards. You need to protect him if you want to get into heaven. The emperor commands the Pope to negotiate with the Lombards. Now, the Pope doesn't want to do this, right? He's already kind of poisoned the well with the Lombards. They had their 40-year treaty that lasted 4 months, okay? But the emperor has commanded it, and so he needs to head north anyway to get to the land of the Franks. So he says, all right, I will do it. And by this time, the Franks have sent a military delegation down to accompany the Pope, to give him protection on his way north. So they are set to accompany the Pope as he makes a detour on his trip to the Frankish kingdom. He makes a detour to the Lombard capital in the city of Pavia. And as they're getting ready to set out, right, the Pope has carefully laid the groundwork for this unprecedented trip north of the Alps. And all of his hopes rest on meeting with the Franks and convincing them to defend his city against the Lombards. As he's ready to make this fateful trip, the Pope falls gravely ill. And his advisors are like, we have to call off this trip. There's no way you're healthy enough to make this trip. But this is where we see the mettle of this particular Pope, Stephen II. Pope Stephen had been an orphan as a child. He was living on the streets of Rome, and the church brought him in along with his brother, took him off the streets, gave him a hot meal and a warm place to sleep, and he is literally a son of the church. And more than that, he's got grit. He says, I've started this thing, I'm going to make this trip no matter what. So as sick as he is, the papal delegation sets out. They make it to Pavia, the capital of the Lombard kingdom, and they spend 2 weeks there in fruitless negotiations. The Lombards are not going to give the papacy what they want, a protection, a promise of protection, a promise of security, right? They feel like they've got the upper hand. So after 2 weeks, as winter is setting in and the Lombards feel like they have kind of closed off the door to the papacy trying to venture north of the Alps at this time of year, the Pope sets out, and weather be danged, he's going to make this trip over the Alps. Now, this is a trip that is dangerous to make in the summertime, right? He's setting out at the beginning of winter. And there are lots of stories about people who get caught in a November blizzard and are never heard from again. But his situation is such, he's got to make this trip while he's got the chance before the next season for warfare comes around and the Lombards can seize Rome. So they make this arduous, dangerous journey over the Alps. The Pope is still ailing, but he pushes through and they make it over the Alps in winter miraculously. So now they are in the Frankish kingdom. Pepin has sent his own son Charles, the future Charlemagne, for those of you who've heard the name. Pepin has sent his son Charles to meet the Pope and escort him north toward Pepin's capital. And once they get within 3 miles of Pepin's capital, Pepin himself comes out to meet the Pope. And this 3 miles is significant because in this time frame, it was a huge honor if somebody came out 1 mile from their city to meet you and escort you into their city. Pepin triples that. I'm going to pay you 3 times the honor that might be paid to a Roman emperor, for example. So Pepin comes out 3 miles to meet the Pope, and the Pope is riding on a horse. Pepin rides out until he gets to within sight of the Pope, and Pepin dismounts. He walks the final distance to the Pope, who's still sitting on his horse. And when Pepin gets there, he prostrates himself. This is the king of the Frankish Empire, a man who bows to nobody, and he lays flat on the ground in front of the Pope until the Pope bids him rise. This is a dramatic scene for everybody watching, showing exactly how much power, how much respect there is for the papacy. After the Pope bids him rise, Pepin goes over and takes hold of the Pope's horse's bridle, and he walks the Pope 3 miles into the city. Pepin is behaving like a groom, the lowliest servant that a mounted warrior can deal with. That's what Pepin is doing for the Pope. He is acting as a groom for the Pope. So they get to the capital city and the Pope rests up and they set a meeting where Pepin has called all of his most important advisors, the leading men of the kingdom together. They've all seen what has transpired. They've seen Pepin prostrate himself before the Pope. And this idea that this is St. Peter's vicar under our roof. So they set a meeting where Pepin knows what the Pope is going to ask, right? But he wants all of his people to hear it directly. And they're expecting the Pope to come out in his papal robes and his tiara, looking as majestic as he did when he approached the city on horseback. But instead, when the Pope enters the room, his hair is all messed up. He's got sackcloth on. He's been crying. His eyes are red. He looks a complete mess. And it's the Pope who falls on the floor in front of Pepin and begs for assistance for St. Peter from these terrible Lombards. This is another dramatic scene that the Pope has staged to appeal to the sentiments of these people who are so in awe of him. Here's this majestic figure, the keeper of the keys of heaven, begging us like a common vagrant on the street. So Pepin is moved, his advisors are moved to promise their protection, but we have to convince the warriors. I don't have it in my power to give you everything that you want, Pope. So the Pope goes and spends the winter at the Abbey of Saint Denis to recover from his illness. And meanwhile, Pepin has to figure out, how do I convince the Frankish warriors to make war on the Lombards? So in the spring, he convenes the entire Frankish army, as is the custom. And it's here where he's going to make his appeal to get their support for the Lombards. He's got it all figured out in his mind, what he's going to say, how he's going to convince them to make war on the Lombards, their erstwhile allies. And as he gets up to make his speech, there's a commotion in the crowd, okay? And suddenly, who shows up after a decade of absence? His brother Carloman. Remember, Carloman had become a monk, and Carloman had actually left the Frankish kingdom to become a monk in Italy. And in fact, he becomes a monk at Monte Cassino, which is under Lombard control. The abbot of Monte Cassino is a Lombard. And so it is quite likely that the abbot has commanded Carloman to come north and convince the Franks not to make war on the Lombards. So just at the moment that Pepin is getting ready to make his appeal, right? This very holy man that everybody knows and trusts comes and says, don't do it. Pepin's plans are laying in a big pile at his feet. Everything that he has set up gets messed up. Now he's back to square one. So, first business is deal with Carloman. We're not sending him back to the Lombards. We're not letting that happen again. So he confines Carloman to a Frankish monastery, and shortly after, Carloman dies. Possibly of natural causes, possibly not. So now, what do? How do we convince the Frankish warriors to support Pepin in what he feels like he owes St. Peter, owes the Pope? And this is where the papacy plays its whole card. This is where the papacy pulls out the ace it has up its sleeve. The papacy produces a document that is going to tip the balance in their favor. And it all kind of goes back to this legend that is current at this time about the Emperor Constantine the Great. Remember, Constantine the Great was the Roman emperor who embraced Christianity and took the Roman Empire from persecuting the Christians to becoming itself Christian. A huge, towering figure in the mindset of Christians of this time. Well, their legend about how Constantine came to embrace Christianity involves the Pope at that time, Pope Sylvester. And as the story went, Constantine had contracted leprosy. And so he went first to his pagan astrologers and soothsayers and said, how do I deal with this? I can't be emperor and be a leper. And so they had counseled him, his pagan advisors had counseled him to kill and consume some Christian children, drink the blood of some Christian children. And Constantine's like, that doesn't sound right. So he summons the Christian Pope, Pope Sylvester. And Pope Sylvester prays to St. Peter, and St. Peter cures Constantine of his leprosy. And as a result, Constantine is so grateful that not only does he convert to Christianity, but he writes out a will. And in this will, he says, you know, I'm going to go make a new capital over in Constantinople and rule the eastern part of the Roman Empire. I'm giving you, Pope Sylvester, all of the western half of the Roman Empire. This will is called the donation of Constantine. And of course, as the story goes, the Pope says, well, I'm not in any position to rule the whole Western Empire. I'm going to give it back to you, Constantine, to rule on my behalf. I still own it. The papacy still owns the western half of the Roman Empire, but we're letting you run it for us. You're our property management company, okay? So this document that the papacy produces at this moment in time is called the donation of Constantine, but it's now proven to be a forgery, right? If you remember the class we had on Constantine, contemporary sources or near contemporary sources had a completely different story about how Constantine became a Christian, right? Had nothing to do with leprosy and hope and whatnot, right? He saw a Christian symbol in the sky on the eve of the battle, okay? So in the Middle Ages, monks and scholars started looking at this thing saying, there's a lot of things in here that don't sound right. They've got Constantine dealing with the Huns, right? And we know the Huns didn't come along for 100 years after Constantine. And there were other problems with the story. The long and short of it is that nobody believes this is a legitimate document. And in fact, the Catholic Encyclopedia, right? The Catholic Church's own encyclopedia says this about the donation of Constantine. By this name is understood, since the end of the Middle Ages, a forged document of Emperor Constantine the Great. This is the Pope's forgery. Now, I will give you one disclaimer. We know the Pope's forgery. We know that the donation of Constantine came about around this time. We don't have any direct evidence that the Pope pulled it out at this particular moment. This is Mike's thesis on how the donation of Constantine was used, but it all makes sense when you look at how the wavering Frankish aristocracy was finally convinced to make war on the Lombards. So they have a ceremony at Easter, the most holy holiday in the Christian calendar. The donation of Constantine is circulated, and it becomes clear that the Lombards, by attacking imperial territory in Italy, have not attacked the empire. They haven't attacked that guy living over in Constantinople. They have attacked the Pope, who is the true owner of everything in the West. They have attacked St. Peter, the holder to the keys of heaven. So the question is put to them. Now that you know who the Lombards have really attacked, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the Lombards? Or are you on the side of St. Peter, who holds the keys to the gates of heaven? When you die and you go to the gates of heaven, what do you want to say to St. Peter about this moment? That you stood with him, or that you stood with the Lombards who stole his territory? Can you guess where the Frankish warriors come down? They agree to support Pepin in his war against the Lombards. So after this, Pepin gets a further reward from the papacy. They go to Saint Denis, which is for the French, the equivalent of Westminster Abbey. It's their royal necropolis. It's the most holy church where all the Frankish kings are buried. And at the Abbey of Saint Denis, the Pope himself anoints Pepin king. Remember, Pepin had been anointed as part of the ceremony that made him king, which was a totally new thing to happen. There had never been an anointing of a Frankish king before. No Roman emperor had ever been anointed. But the Pope himself repeats that novel ceremony and anoints Pepin. And he furthermore anoints Pepin's sons, including the future Charlemagne. And he forbids the Franks from ever choosing a king from any other family than Pepin's. And he gives Pepin the title of patrician. Remember, that second highest rank below emperor. Again, he has the authority of the Roman Empire, the Pope is claiming. So he can give out these titles. The popes, or the papacy and the Franks, strengthen their ties. The Franks replace their native Gallic liturgy with a Roman one. And the Pope dedicates the monastery there to Saint Denis, who's the most important. He's the patron saint of the Frankish monarchy, and adds Saint Denis to the church calendar. So he's buttressing the legitimacy of the Frankish monarchy. Pepin, now he's forced to deal with the Lombards, tries like heck to avoid warfare. During the summer of 754, he sends 3 separate embassies, one after another, to the Lombards, imploring them, just give the Pope what he wants. I don't want to have to come beat you up, okay? But that's what's going to happen if you don't do it. And the Lombards are either too proud or too stupid to go along. The Pope actually offers a substantial cash bribe. Take this money. Just don't make me come do what I don't want to do. But the Lombards resist. So Pepin is forced to invade, which he does. His Frankish army quickly defeats the Lombards, and Pepin gives the territory that he takes back from the Lombards to the Pope, rather than giving it back to the empire. Pepin thinks he's done what he needs to do, so he withdraws, leaving Aistulf, the Lombard king, in power. And as soon as he's gone, Aistulf is up to his old tricks again, and in fact, he attacks Rome itself and lays siege to the city of Rome. The Franks return, they defeat the Lombards again, and by this time, we get the protest from the emperor saying, wait, you took back this land, you took back Ravenna that the Lombards had taken from me, and instead of giving it back to me, you gave it to the Pope? What gives? And Pepin's reply, I have done this for no earthly gain, but rather for the love of Saint Peter and the remission of my sins. So we get a clear picture of Pepin's motivation. So this time, Pepin leaves behind a force, an army, to enforce the treaty that he's just made with the Lombards. And in a ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, they bring in the keys to Ravenna and all these other imperial cities that the Franks have taken back from the Lombards. And they take these keys and they lower them onto St. Peter's tomb. They lower them down that shaft. And on this day is declared the creation of the Republic of St. Peter. In other words, a sphere of territory in Italy that the Pope, that St. Peter controls directly. This is going to be called during the Middle Ages the Papal States, which will exist for over 1,000 years. The Papal States will be its own entity in Italy. In 1861, Italy is unified. We get the Kingdom of Italy. Instead of all these little city-states, it's all brought together into one kingdom, except for the city of Rome. The city of Rome is the last holdout in Italy. And in 1871, Rome itself is captured by the Kingdom of Italy, and the Pope withdraws to the buildings near St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican. And for this period, for a period of about 60 years, he considers himself a prisoner. They talk about him being the prisoner in the Vatican. And even though all he controls is a few acres, he still behaves as if he runs an entire country. And in 1929, we get the Lateran Treaty between the papacy and the ruler of Italy at that time, a guy named Benito Mussolini. They make a treaty that creates and recognizes Vatican City as its own independent country right there in the city of Rome. So that is the foundation of the Papal States. That is the foundation of Vatican City. Next week, we're going to look at the aftermath. What happens to the papacy after they become temporal rulers? And it's not a good story, okay? And we're going to see how the papacy resurrects the Roman Empire in the West. Any questions about what I covered tonight before we turn you loose a couple minutes late? Yeah, Joe.
Was there any like direct kind of influence from the original, I guess we call it,
The Bishop of Alexandria? Not much. There were definitely, some refugees from Egypt that came to Italy when the Muslims invaded, but the Muslims had pretty well converted most of the people to Christianity or to Islam.
There is another pope.
The Bishop of Alexandria was called the Pope.
There in Pope still today. It's a Coptic, it's an Egyptian church. They call their bishop the Pope. And really
It's a Greek word that means father, is what it is.
Yeah, it's basically a father. And so one of the things that happened there is they said the Orthodox Church tried to meet with the papacy, but they finally broke off in about 1054. They finally said that's when the big break happened. They never really could get cooperation, and some of that was political. The division between the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. What's interesting is what Stephen does with Pepin sets up the idea of the Pope having authority over the kings.
Yep.
Which sets up for us as United Methodists, King Henry VIII. Because all the kings up until Henry VIII were intimidated by the Pope. You don't go against the Pope. And because all the other kings went with the Pope. So if you went against the Pope, you had to deal with all these other kings who got mad at you and wanted to fight you, including the Roman Empire.
Or the Pope would excommunicate you.
Yeah, all right.
And then
He
your
would excommunicate you.
followers didn't have
And
to
so
follow
it
you.
sets up this thing where Henry VIII says, I want to be the head of the church. You know, I wanted to do what I want to do. So that's important because, of course, that forms the Church of England, which eventually, you know, John Wesley is a part of. And so that protest, so to speak, at that time against the Pope and Roman authority. So it sets up that, and so up until that time, until Henry VIII, no one stood up to the Pope, or they placed the Pope in this authoritative position until Henry VIII came in.
Hold that thought, because in future classes, we're going to look at a couple unsuccessful attempts to stand up to
Okay.
the Pope.
Yeah.
Not in this class, but any questions from out in Zoom land? All right, well, thank you guys for sticking around for an extra 5 minutes. I do appreciate it, and we will see you again next Monday with any luck.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And stop the recording here. How do I stop sharing? There we go. Okay, stop cloud recording.